and welcome to the Midnight Company. My name is Ama Lea, and I'm here today to show you something I got to do recently that was super cool. I got to be guest editor for Delirium Magazine. From cover to cover, this thing is all mine, and I just kind of wanted to walk you guys through it and show you behind the scenes of the making of issue 21 of Delirium Magazine. First things first, I really wanted to talk about the cover of this guy. It was done by a local Boston artist named Burnzig. What I really wanted to do with this, I kind of had the idea from the beginning that I wanted it to be a mix of like Blair Witch combined with every sort of 90s thing, you know, reminiscent of the 90s that you could find. And I was really looking for an artist who had that sort of 90s aesthetic, and Burnzig had it in spades. So we created this, and I think everything that he did on it's really amazing. I'm so impressed. In my letter to the editor, which I think was one of the things I was like most excited about doing, because I've worked for horror magazines for about 13-14 years now, and you know, I've gotten to write a thing here or there, but I never really get to write as much as I've been a photographer. So it was really exciting to share my thoughts and to talk about what it was like growing up in the 90s. And that was sort of my mission statement for this issue, is to make it for the people who grew up in that time, but also educate people who were, you know, grew up after her, the younger generations. The first article we come to is Evil Ed, and it's by Matthew Abrams, who's a good friend of mine. He's also manager of Creature Feature. He did sort of like a psychological evaluation of Evil Ed, and it's really something you have to read for yourself. I can't really tell you about, so this is definitely a good reason to pick up this issue. Alright, and our next article is The 90's, A Beast of a Decade. This is about 90s creature features, which is one of my personal favorite parts of the 90s, and there's nobody better to write it than Mark Gottlieb, who's sort of my resident creature feature fanatic friend. And this is probably like our third collaboration. We actually just finished an anthology film together called Deathstember. I directed a segment called 5 Deaths in Blood Red, and he wrote it, so this was very cool to have another project with him. So the next article is written by the legendary Mike Gingold. He wrote a really cool article about the MPAA in the 90s and kind of the movies that snuck past it. And I believe this is going to be a book too, so make sure to check this out. The next article was a must-have for me as well. It is about Bride of Chucky, and to me this is like one of the best movies to come out of the 90s, and definitely, maybe this is a bad thing to say, I don't know, unpopular opinion, but my favorite Child's Play movie in the series. I think one of the best parts is the addition of Jennifer Tilly and her character of Tiffany. It's super iconic. I don't know if I've seen a Halloween since then where there haven't been 10 people dressed up as her. Yeah, this is a legendary movie to me, and it was written by Brennan Klein. Next up is this really fun little article about the board game Nightmare by J.P. Willett. Nightmare is this great board game. If you weren't around in the 90s, you've probably never seen it. You put the VHS in and you follow along and play, and it's spooky and it's fun and it's kind of corny. If you're a fan of board games, I think you can still get it on eBay for under $50. So check out the article and check out the board game as well. The next article is the one that made this issue happen. It is about Devon Sawa. It was sort of a bucket list for me to get a chance to photograph him, so I was like, we have to do a thing with Devon Sawa. He's done all these movies, and a lot of them are getting ready to have anniversaries, and I suggested, what if he did like a 90s issue? And it was really fun because I got a lot of my girlfriends who are huge fans be zombie girls like in their underwear with him, so I feel like I don't owe any of them a Christmas present this year. The next article is about 90s soundtracks. You know, Brian Collins wrote this, and if you know his work, he loves the 90s and he loves music from the 90s, so I couldn't think of a more perfect person to write this. And the next thing we have is Treehouse of Horror from The Simpsons, and I gotta be honest, I'm not the biggest Simpsons fan, but I know a lot of you are. I love the Treehouse of Horror intros every year, and I think this is a great addition to this one way or another. Alright, next up we have R.L. Stine by Amy Segarra, and this is definitely an article I knew from the beginning had to be in this issue. Goosebumps was the gateway drug into horror. Very stoked to have this article in here. Next is one of my personal 90s favorites, Tales from the Hood. Growing up, I watched this movie at least like once a month or so from the time it came out until I went to college. As an adult and working in horror, I've actually gotten to be good friends with Darren Scott, who was the writer of this movie and the director of the sequel, and he's going to be directing the newest one about to come out. So it was very cool to get an interview with him, and that was written by Erin Maxwell, who's way above Delirium's pay grade, but thankfully she's a good friend who did me a solid favor. Thank you, Erin. Alright, and next up is the cover story. It's about the Blair Witch Project, and even more cool is that we got both of the directors of the original movie in to do some interviews, and they shared a lot of their like personal photographs from set and after with us. So some very cool exclusive stuff here. Very, very excited to have that in here. And next we have an article about Freddy Krueger in the 90s. 90s Freddy took a very weird, very like pop culture-y, interesting turn, I guess you could say. And I wanted to cover that, and we got very lucky with this article too. It's written by Amy Segarra again, but we got interviews with Robert Englund and Heather Langenkamp and Rachel Talalay, director of Freddy's Dead. So there's lots of cool info to get from this article, lots of pictures. Definitely check this out. Alright, next up we have one of my favorite articles of the whole issue. It might actually be my favorite. It's written by Josh Miller. He did a great little piece with Mick Garris about kind of the explosion of Stephen King in the 90s and how it was a lot of TV movies and a lot of hype and a lot of everything. And what I really loved about this issue is that Mick Garris was either directing or producing a lot of these projects. So we're getting a really in-depth look at, you know, this era of King and how it came to be. So this alone to me is worth the cover cost of this issue. And next we have an article about Are You Afraid of the Dark? It's really cool because it's written by the two writers of the new series, Ben David Grabinski and Jared Rivet, and they list their top 5 favorite episodes of the original series. And it was really cool because I know a lot of this came from like their research doing the new show, which if you haven't seen yet, kills. It is so good. It's probably my favorite thing I've seen in 2019. I would take the new series over it too, and you can quote me on that. Next we have this great article by Derek Bathello. If you don't know who Derek Bathello is, he did an amazing book about all things Giallo and Argento, and luckily we got him to do this piece on Clive Barker in the 90s, which is definitely something close to my heart. I'm a huge Clive Barker fan, and my sort of intro to Clive Barker was being a teenager and watching Nightbreed and Lord of Illusions before Hellraiser. So this one I was definitely over the moon about. And next up we have a piece by Lacey Page on the slasher Popcorn. I got to see Popcorn years ago when Netflix just started doing streaming, and it was on there, and I didn't even know it existed as a kid or when it came out, but I loved it, and then it disappeared, and luckily I think there's a Blu-ray out now, like one of those 4K sort of releases. But definitely one of my favorite lost movies in the 90s. So underrated. Something I really love about this article is this original piece by Nocturnal Visions from Popcorn, and I actually wish it had been featured bigger in this article because I love it so much, and he is selling prints of that, I believe, on his website, so look him up, Nocturnal Visions. So our last article comes from BJ Colangelo, a filmmaker and journalist out of Cleveland. She's really one of my favorite people working right now as well, and I think she has a really unique voice to lend to the genre. So anytime I get to work with her, I will absolutely say yes. She chose to do an article on So Weird. It's actually like a Disney Channel show from the 90s, and it was one that I personally wasn't familiar with, but it had a female lead, and it seemed to be important to a lot of people. And lastly, we have an article by the man himself, Charles Band, owner of Delirium, and he talks about his experience of making movies in the 90s and what that was like. So yeah. That is our issue, cover to cover. You can buy your own at fullmoondirect.com, and my name is Ama Lea. Thank you so much for watching.